The knock came at 11:47 at night. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on my dashboard, watching the minutes drag by, trying to decide if I should move the truck to a different lot before the security guard made his second round. The Walmart on Route 9 was usually quiet after 10, and I'd learned that if you parked near the cart returns, nobody bothered you much. But 3 nights in a row was pushing it, even for an old man in a beat-up Ford F-250 with a cracked taillight and a sleeping bag that smelled like it had given up on life. The flashlight hit my window before I heard the footsteps. I sat up slow. My back had been doing this thing lately, where it seized up if I moved too fast, like the muscles had decided to file a formal complaint about sleeping upright in a truck cab at 63 years old. I rolled down the window manually. The electric one had stopped working. Sometime around the same week my son changed the locks on my own front door and looked into the beam. "Sir, you doing okay tonight?" She was young. Couldn't have been more than 26, maybe 27, with a sheriff's department patch on her shoulder and the kind of expression that told me she'd done this before and hadn't decided yet how she felt about it. Not mean, not exactly warm either. Professional. "I'm fine," I said. "Just resting. License and registration, please." I didn't argue. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with a badge at midnight when you're sleeping in a parking lot is one of the least productive things a person can do. I reached into the glove compartment, found the registration under a folded map of Montana that I'd never actually needed, and handed both over along with my driver's license. She took them back to her cruiser. I sat there in the dark and listened to the parking lot. A shopping cart was rolling slowly across the asphalt somewhere, pushed by nothing but the October wind coming down off the Rockies. It was the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, quiet and permanent, the way bad luck does. My name is James Harmon. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for Morrison Greer Construction out of Billings, Montana. I raised one son in a 4-bedroom house on Clearwater Drive that my wife, Donna, picked out the week after we got married because she said the kitchen window had the right light for growing herbs. I coached Little League for 6 seasons. I never missed a mortgage payment. I drove sensible vehicles and mowed my lawn on Saturday mornings and voted in every election since I turned 18. And in the fall of my 63rd year, I was sleeping in a Walmart parking lot with $47 in my wallet and a sleeping bag that smelled like regret. This is how it happened. Donna died in March of the previous year. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that doesn't give you much warning and doesn't give you much time. We had 8 months from diagnosis to the day I sat in a funeral home in downtown Billings and picked out a casket while my son, Derek, stood next to me checking his phone. 8 months. Some people get years. Some people get decades. We got 8 months, and I spent most of them holding her hand and pretending I wasn't terrified. Derek was 41. He'd moved back to Billings 6 years earlier with his wife, Carla, after a stint in Denver that hadn't worked out the way they'd planned. I'd helped them buy a place across town. Not a gift exactly, more of a loan that we'd all silently agreed would never be repaid, the kind of financial arrangement that families make when they love each other and don't want to make things awkward. I'd paid for their wedding. I'd co-signed on their car. I'd done what fathers do when they can and when they believe it means something. The trouble started about 2 weeks after Donna's funeral. Derek came to the house on a Tuesday evening. He brought Carla, which should have been my first signal, because Carla had a specific look she wore when she was there to accomplish something rather than to visit. She sat at my kitchen table and kept her coat on, which no one does in their own family's home unless they're planning to leave quickly. Derek said they needed to talk about the estate. I told him there wasn't much to talk about. The house was paid off. There was about $200,000 in retirement savings, some of which had taken a hit when the market dipped the previous year. There was a small life insurance policy on Donna that would cover burial and a few months of expenses. Nothing complicated. I'd already spoken to a lawyer downtown named Friedman, and everything was in order. Carla said that was actually what they wanted to discuss. Their financial situation. Derek hadn't been working steadily since January. There were some debts. Some things had gotten away from them. I listened. I'd been listening to my son explain how things had gotten away from him since he was about 19 years old. I loved him. I still do, even now, which is the part I have the hardest time explaining to people. You don't stop loving your children just because they do something that breaks something permanently inside you. I told them I'd help where I could. I wasn't in a position to hand over large sums. I had my own retirement to think about. But I could help with some of the immediate pressure. That wasn't what they were asking. What they were asking, it turned out, and it came out slowly, one piece at a time, the way bad news always does when people are trying to wrap it in reasonable language, was for me to sign over the house, put it in Derek's name. They'd take over the property taxes, handle the upkeep. I could stay, they said. For now. We could figure out the living arrangement as we went. I should have said no. I should have stood up from that table and said no, clearly and without apology, the way Donna would have said no if she'd been there. She had a gift for it. She could decline things without making anyone feel attacked, but there was never any question about the answer. But Donna wasn't there. And I was 62 years old and 4 months out from burying my wife, and I was so tired I couldn't see straight, and my son was sitting across from me saying he needed help, and I'd spent 40 years believing that help was what you gave your family when they needed it. I signed the papers. I don't think I fully understood what I was signing. That's not an excuse. I was a grown man with an engineering degree and enough life experience to know better. But Carla had her brother draw up the documents, and they were presented to me on a Sunday afternoon, and there was a lot of language in them that I didn't read carefully enough, and when I asked about certain sections, Derek said, "Don't worry about it. It's just standard." And I believed him because he was my son. What I'd signed wasn't what they described. I'd transferred full ownership of the house with no right of residency attached, no cohabitation agreement, no financial protections. I'd also, in a separate document I hadn't fully tracked, granted Derek power of attorney over my personal accounts during a period I was supposedly incapacitated by grief language Carla's brother had slipped in and that I'd skimmed past. I found out the accounts had been touched when my debit card was declined at the grocery store. When I got home that evening, the locks had been changed. My clothes were in 2 garbage bags on the front porch. The herbs in Donna's kitchen window were gone. The porch light, which had been on every night for 22 years, was off. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for 2 hours. Then I drove to my bank and spent 40 minutes learning that my savings account had been reduced to $900 and that the changes had been authorized through a power of attorney document they had on file. When I tried to dispute it, they handed me a form and told me to contact an attorney. I drove to Friedman's office. He told me I had a case. He also told me it would take time and money and that, in the meantime, there wasn't much he could do about the immediate housing situation. Time and money. I had $47 by the time October came around. I'd been staying in the truck for 6 weeks, using the YMCA downtown for showers, eating at the food pantry on Tuesdays and the church on 4th Street on Thursdays. I'd applied for 4 jobs. I wasn't complaining, exactly. Complaining felt like something I no longer had the energy for. I was just existing, trying to figure out what the next step was without being able to see the floor beneath me. So, when the young deputy came back to my truck window with my license and registration, I wasn't braced for anything in particular. Another warning, maybe. A suggestion to move along. I'd heard both before. She stood at the window for a moment without speaking. I looked at her face and something had changed in it. Not dramatically. But there was a quality there that hadn't been there before, a kind of careful attention, like she'd just been told something that required her to recalibrate. "Mr. Harmon," she said. "James Allen Harmon? That's right. Date of birth?" I told her. She looked down at the clipboard she was holding and then back at me. "And your mother's maiden name, sir?" That was an unusual question. I told her it was Paulson, Margaret Paulson, from Missoula originally. She wrote something down. Then she said, "Sir, would you be willing to come inside the store with me for a few minutes? There's a night manager here I think you should speak with." I didn't understand that at all. The Walmart manager? His name's Ray Kowalski. He used to work in banking. I need to show him something from your registration. It's not about any violation. I just think you should talk to him. I didn't have anywhere to be. Ray Kowalski was a large man in his late 50s, with a Walmart vest over a flannel shirt and the kind of hands that suggested he'd done physical work before he'd done desk work. He was standing near the customer service counter when we came in, and when the deputy handed him something, I couldn't see what he went very still. Not frozen. Still. The way a person goes still when they're adding something up and don't want to make a mistake. He looked at me. "You're Jim Harmon, from Morrison Greer Construction?" "I was," I said. "Retired about 4 years ago." He set whatever he'd been holding down on the counter. "I worked at First Northern Bank for 18 years before I came here. Commercial Accounts Division." He paused. "I processed a transaction in 2006, part of a corporate restructuring. Morrison Greer was going private and then public again. You were there for that?" I remembered it vaguely. There had been a period around 2005 or 2006 when the company had gone through some significant changes in ownership structure. I'd been a senior engineer at the time, not involved in the financial side. I'd been asked to sign some documents. I remembered signing them. "I signed something," I said. Honestly, I didn't fully understand what. Ray Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "I think what you signed," he said carefully, "may have included an equity stake, a small percentage of the restructured company." He paused again. "Morrison Greer went public on the NYSE in 2009. They were acquired by a national infrastructure firm in 2019, for it was a significant number. I remember reading about it. I felt nothing yet. Too many bad things had happened recently for good news to land quickly. Why are you telling me this?" He picked up what he'd been holding. It was a photocopy of my registration, my address from before, Clearwater Drive, which I'd never updated. "That address," he said. I recognized it. There were registered correspondence attempts to that address for years from a fiduciary escrow account. Unclaimed equity distributions. I remember the file because it was flagged multiple times and kept coming back undeliverable. He looked at me steadily. "If I'm remembering correctly, Mr. Harmon, there is an escrow account sitting with the Montana State Unclaimed Property Division that has your name on it. And based on the acquisition numbers I remember, I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. The amount is not small." The deputy was standing slightly behind me. I heard her shift her weight. "How not small?" I asked. Ray Kowalski said a number. I had to ask him to repeat it. He did. I sat down on a bench near the exit doors. I didn't plan to. My legs simply decided that standing was no longer a reasonable expectation. Let me explain what had happened in 2006, because I've since hired people to explain it to me very carefully, and I understand it now in ways I didn't then. When Morrison Greer restructured in advance of their public offering, 3 senior employees were offered what the documents called founding equity participation, meaning we received small ownership stakes in the new corporate entity in lieu of bonuses that the company didn't have liquid cash to pay at the time. The percentage was less than 2% in my case. Less than 2% sounds small. It is small, until the company you own less than 2% of gets acquired for $4.8 billion. At the time of acquisition, my stake, which had been sitting in an escrow account maintained by a fiduciary firm in Denver, which had been sending letters to Clearwater Drive for 11 years, none of which I had ever received because they arrived before Donna died, and she thought they were junk mail, and then, after she died, they were apparently collected by Derek, and Carla was worth approximately $62 million. $62 million had been sitting in an account with my name on it for 11 years. I want to be accurate about what I felt in the days after Ray Kowalski told me that number. People expect a certain kind of reaction. Euphoria. Relief. Some cinematic moment of tears and laughter. What I actually felt, for a long time, was a kind of gray numbness. Like the information was too large for the part of my brain that processed information, and it just sat there, unprocessed, while I drove back to the Walmart parking lot and lay in my sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling of my truck. Donna wasn't there. That was the first thing I kept coming back to. She wasn't there. She'd spent 22 years growing herbs in a kitchen window and shopping sales and clipping coupons and worrying quietly about whether we'd have enough for retirement. She'd been gone for a year and 4 months, and she wasn't there. I hired an attorney, not Friedman, a firm in Billings with 4 names on the door and a corner office on the 6th floor. I paid the retainer from an advance they agreed to extend against the pending estate claim, which is the kind of thing attorneys will do when the numbers are large enough. The escrow account was confirmed within 3 weeks. The Montana Unclaimed Property Division had a clean record of the funds. The fiduciary in Denver had complete documentation. My identity was verified through 3 independent channels. The equity distribution, including 11 years of held interest and investment growth, came to slightly over $78 million by the time the final accounting was complete. My attorney, whose name was Patricia Wenzel, and who did not visibly react to large numbers the way normal people do, handled the transfer with a quietness that I came to deeply appreciate. She also handled what came next. What came next was Derek. He called me in November, about 3 weeks after I'd moved into a rental house on the north side of Billings. Nothing remarkable. 2 bedrooms, a yard with a fence, the first place I'd slept in a real bed in 2 months. He'd heard something, apparently. Word moves through a town like Billings faster than most people expect, especially when it involves names and numbers that don't usually go together. He called me on a Tuesday evening, and his voice had a quality I recognized. It was the voice he used when he wanted something he knew he didn't deserve. A specific combination of warmth and apology and carefully positioned need that he'd been refining since he was about 15 years old. He said he wanted to talk. He said there were things he wasn't proud of. He said he and Carla had been under a lot of pressure and he hoped I could understand. I let him talk for a while. Then, I told him that Patricia Wenzel's office would be in touch, and I wished him well, and I hung up. Patricia's office filed a civil suit within the month. Fraudulent transfer of property. Financial elder abuse, which is a specific and serious designation under Montana law. Unauthorized use of power of attorney. The documentation was thorough. That's a variaken to vozer azer. Carla's brother, the one who'd drawn up the original papers, turned out to have some significant professional vulnerabilities once a forensic accountant started looking at his other work. I want to be honest about something. I didn't pursue the legal case primarily because I wanted money back. The house on Clearwater Drive, I didn't want to live there anymore. Too many mornings standing in a kitchen where herb pots used to be. The retirement savings were a minor consideration at this point. What I wanted, and what I told Patricia directly, was accountability. I wanted Derek to stand in a courtroom and have a judge look at the documents his wife's brother had drafted and have someone in authority say, out loud, that what they'd done had a name. The civil judgment came through the following April. The house was ordered returned to my name. The remaining retirement funds, minus legal costs, were recovered. Derek was ordered to pay a financial penalty under the elder abuse statute. Carla's brother surrendered his notary license. Criminal charges for financial elder abuse were referred to the county prosecutor's office. I was told by people who knew more about these things than I do that the outcome would likely involve a suspended sentence given the circumstances and that I should calibrate my expectations accordingly. I told Patricia that I understood. What mattered was that the referral existed, that the file existed, that there was a record somewhere that said, "This happened, and it was wrong, and we do not pretend otherwise." Derek called me once more, about a week after the civil judgment. I answered, which surprised me. I don't know why I did. Maybe because I'm 63 years old and I've buried one person I loved completely, and I'm aware that the list of people I have left is shorter than it used to be. He didn't ask for anything this time. He just said he was sorry. The way he said it was different from how he usually said, sorry, less architecture, less construction. Just the words, sitting there without any scaffolding around them. I told him I heard him. I didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't fine. I didn't tell him I forgave him, because that's not something I can manufacture on schedule. I told him I heard him, because I did. And then I said goodbye and I sat for a while in my new kitchen, looking out a window that didn't face west the way Donna's had. I should tell you about Ray Kowalski, because this story isn't complete without him. I went back to that Walmart in December, 3 weeks before Christmas. I bought a set of good pots and pans I'd been meaning to get, and a decent coffee maker, and some other things for the new house. At the customer service counter, I asked for the night manager. The young woman at the counter said he was on break and offered to get him. He came out from the back with a coffee in his hand and recognized me immediately. He said my name the same way he had in October, careful, attentive, like he was still doing the math. I told him I wanted him to know how things had turned out. I told him the number, which I'd previously told to very few people. His expression was something I will remember for a long time. Not greed, not excitement. Something more like relief, like he'd made a bet on something years ago and finally found out he'd been right to make it. He said he was glad. I thanked him. He said he'd only done what anyone would do. I told him that most people wouldn't have done it, that most people, at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in October when they're supposed to be managing a retail store, do not stop to make a connection between a photocopy of a registration and an 18-year-old banking memory. He considered that and shrugged, and said he had a good memory for accounts. We shook hands. I left. The deputy who'd come to my truck, her name was Sergeant Avery Tatum. I'd found out, received a letter from Patricia's office at the end of January, explaining the situation in general terms and expressing my gratitude. I was told she called the office and said it wasn't necessary and she was just doing her job. I was told this in a tone that suggested Patricia found it refreshing. Patricia deals with a lot of people who are not just doing their jobs. I've been in the house on the north side of Billings for about 8 months now. I hired a landscaper to put in a garden bed along the south fence, and in April I planted herbs, basil, rosemary, thyme, the same ones Donna always kept on her windowsill. They didn't do as well as hers did. They probably never will. But they were there, in the ground, growing in the direction of something. I've set up a foundation. It's administered through the same firm that handles my investment accounts, and it's directed primarily at housing support for seniors in Montana who are facing displacement, whether from family situations, medical costs, or simply the math of getting old in a country that makes getting old expensive. The foundation is named the Margaret Paulson Harmon Fund, after my mother, who was from Missoula and who raised me to believe that you pay your debts, and you help your neighbors, and you don't walk past someone who's sleeping in a parking lot without making sure they're all right. Donna's herbs are on the kitchen windowsill now. Small pots, clay ones, the same kind she used. The light isn't the same as on Clearwater Drive. It comes in later in the morning, and it's a different angle. But it's there. Light is there if you put something in the right place for it. I think about those 2 garbage bags on the porch a lot. I don't think about them with anger anymore, mostly. I think about them as information. They told me something I'd been too comfortable to know, that I'd been living in a way that left me exposed, that I'd made decisions based on trust that wasn't anchored in anything solid, that I'd confused love with protection and found out they're not the same thing. I also think about what Ray Kowalski did and what Deputy Tatum did, because both of them had easy choices available. He could have said nothing. She could have told me to move along. Neither of them had any obligation to me. I was a stranger in a parking lot, nobody's problem, easy to overlook. They didn't overlook me. I don't know what to make of that exactly, except that it seems important. In a year that had stripped away everything I thought I understood about who I could count on, 2 strangers in a Walmart parking lot turned out to be the fulcrum everything else turned on. I didn't know their names. They didn't know mine. They just paid attention. Patricia Wenzel asked me once, during the early stages of the case, whether I wanted to go after Derek criminally in addition to civilly. She said it was my call and she wanted to understand what outcome I was actually working toward. I thought about it for a long time. I told her I wanted the record. I wanted the documentation. I wanted something on file somewhere that said the facts plainly, without softening or context or the kind of language that makes wrongdoing sound like a misunderstanding. But I wasn't looking to destroy my son. He was still my son. He would be my son when I was dead, and the money was dispersed, and the house on Clearwater Drive had been sold to someone who would put their own things in the kitchen windows. Patricia said she understood. She didn't editorialize, which is one of the things I've come to respect most about her. The last time I saw Derek in person was at the civil proceeding. He looked older than I expected. I don't know why that surprised me. Time was moving for him the same as it was for me. He sat at a table across the room, and he didn't look at me for most of the hearing. But at one point near the end, when the judge was reading the findings, he looked up and we were looking at each other for a moment. I don't know what he saw. What I saw was a man who had made bad choices and who would have to find a way to live with them. That's not so different from most people. When you reduce it down that far, the scale was different. The specifics were different. The fact of being a person who made bad choices and has to keep living that part I recognized. I drove home after the hearing on a clear afternoon in April. The mountains north of Billings were still carrying snow on their upper ridges, but the valley was showing the first real green of the year, that particular shade of early spring grass that looks like someone turned up the saturation slightly on the world. I took the long way back through the countryside rather than the highway. I had nowhere to be. At 63 years old, I own a small house with a garden bed. I have a foundation that helps people who are sleeping in parking lots figure out what comes next. I have a good attorney and a careful financial advisor and a coffee maker that makes better coffee than I deserve. I have $78 million, roughly, minus taxes and legal costs and the money already seeded into the foundation and a few other things I've done with it that I don't feel the need to go into here. And I have a windowsill with herbs on it that don't grow as well as Donna's did, but that are there every morning when I come into the kitchen, green and stubborn and pointed at the light. Some mornings that's enough. Some mornings it's more than enough. Some mornings I think about the parking lot, the cold, the flashlight, the woman with the clipboard asking for my license, the particular quality of the night and how it had felt so final, so completely closed, and how I could not have imagined, not in any configuration I was capable of imagining, what was about to walk through a door I couldn't see yet. I think about that when people ask me what I've learned. Because they do ask. People ask that question more than you'd expect once they know the shape of the story. What I've learned is this. The door doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send a signal. It doesn't look like a door. It looks like a deputy with a clipboard and a night manager with an old banking memory and a parking lot at 11:47 on a Tuesday. You can't see it. You can only stay awake long enough to be there when it opens.